Captain Marcus Reed was dragged into the celestial court with the kind of dignity that comes from accepting inevitable death without surrendering one's integrity. The ceremonial chains that bound him were forged from Sci-Fi crystalline metal, designed more for symbolic weight than actual restraint, though his weeks of captivity had left him in no condition to resist even if escape were possible. The throne room stretched before him like a cathedral carved from living starlight, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into luminous mists while walls of translucent crystal channeled the binary sunlight into patterns that painted everything in shifting hues of silver and gold. Hundreds of Sci-Fi nobility lined the vast space, their ethereal forms creating a gallery of otherworldly beauty that had witnessed countless executions but rarely one carrying such political significance. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais that seemed to float above the crystalline floor, Empress Lyralii of the Celestial Court waited with the terrible patience of someone who had already decided how this encounter would end. 7 feet of elegant predator, she commanded attention through presence rather than movement, her opalescent skin shifting between silver and blue as emotions played across features that combined alien beauty with unmistakably regal authority. Her wings, 15 feet of gossamer membrane stretched between supporting structures that resembled spun silver, remained folded behind her throne, though Marcus could see the way they shifted slightly with her breathing, suggesting controlled tension rather than true calm. The Sci-Fi were descended from aerial hunters, and even in their most civilized moments, they retained the predatory grace that had made them the dominant species on a world of floating cities and crystalline peaks. Captain Marcus Reed, Empress Lyralii's voice carried harmonics that made even formal pronouncements sound like music, though the melody currently held undertones of controlled fury. You stand accused of war crimes against the Sci-Fi people. 12 colony worlds attacked, 3 million civilian casualties, strategic intelligence that could only have been obtained through systematic betrayal of the peace accords. Marcus listened to the charges with the weary acceptance of someone who had spent weeks maintaining his innocence against overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise. The attacks had been precisely coordinated, targeting Sci-Fi settlements with knowledge of defensive weaknesses that indicated intimate familiarity with their military capabilities. The tactical patterns matched his own strategic preferences, while biological evidence placed him at several attack sites despite his clear memories of being elsewhere during those periods. The evidence against you is comprehensive, Empress Lyralii continued, rising from her throne with movements that seemed to operate outside normal gravity. Genetic traces at attack sites, tactical analysis that matches your psychological profile, and communication intercepts that bear your personal identification codes. The courtroom murmured with satisfaction as their empress outlined the case against the human who had shattered their peace and murdered their families. Marcus understood their need for justice, even as he maintained his certainty that he had never committed the crimes for which he was about to die. Have you any final words before sentence is carried out? Empress Lyralii asked, descending from her dais with the fluid grace that marked all Sci-Fi movement but carrying an intensity that suggested personal investment in his response. Marcus studied her face, noting details that seemed familiar despite their obvious impossibility. Something about the way she held her head when concentrating, the precise angle of her wings when she was thinking through complex problems, the golden flecks in her silver eyes that seemed to catch light in patterns he felt he should recognize. I know I'm innocent, he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space despite its conversational volume. I know the evidence says otherwise, and I understand why my death is necessary for your people's sense of justice. I don't ask for mercy or clemency, only that you remember that sometimes the truth is more complex than the evidence suggests. Empress Lyralii nodded with what might have been respect for his dignity in the face of death, though Marcus thought he detected something else in her expression, a recognition that went beyond formal appreciation for appropriate final words. She drew the ceremonial blade that would end his life, a weapon forged from the same crystalline metal as his chains but shaped into elegant curves that transformed necessity into art. Sci-Fi executions were swift and precise, designed to honor both the condemned and the requirements of justice through beautiful efficiency. By the authority of the Celestial Court and in the name of those who have died by your hand, Empress Lyralii announced, raising the blade while positioning herself for the precise strike that would sever his major arteries without causing unnecessary suffering, I sentence you to death. The blade began its descent with ceremonial deliberation, giving Marcus time for final thoughts that should have focused on regrets and unfinished business. Instead, he found himself thinking about dreams that had haunted his sleep for years. Visions of flying through crystal cities, holding someone whose face he could never quite see clearly, promising to return from missions that felt like memories rather than imagination. As the blade reached the apex of its arc, Marcus did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He smiled. Not the desperate grin of someone hoping to delay inevitable death, nor the bitter expression of someone facing injustice with defiant humor. Instead, he offered the gentle, sad smile of someone who had found peace with circumstances beyond his control, the expression of a person who understood that some things were more important than individual survival. Empress Lyraliai's blade stopped mid-descent as though she had struck an invisible barrier. Her silver eyes widened with shock that transcended surprise and entered the realm of impossible recognition. The weapon clattered to the crystalline floor with a sound like breaking wind chimes as her hands began trembling with emotions that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than conscious memory. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying enough anguish to silence the murmuring crowd. "It's not possible." Marcus watched her stumble backward, her wings extending instinctively for balance as though the simple act of seeing his smile had disrupted her equilibrium in ways that went beyond physical coordination. Something in her reaction triggered his own sense of recognition, not of her specifically, but of the way her face transformed when she was struggling with emotions too complex for easy expression. "David?" Empress Lyraliai said, her voice breaking on the name as she fell to her knees before the assembled court, her composure shattered by memories that should have been impossible to access. The throne room erupted into chaos as hundreds of Sci-Fi nobility witnessed their empress collapse before a condemned human criminal, their confusion and alarm creating a symphony of voices that echoed through the crystalline architecture. But Marcus barely heard the commotion, his attention focused entirely on Lyraliai's face as she stared at him with growing certainty and desperate hope. "I don't understand," Marcus said, though even as he spoke the words, fragments of dreams began surfacing with startling clarity, memories of promising someone with silver wings that he would find her again, of touching opalescent skin that felt like home, of dying with her name on his lips. "Your smile," Lyraliai whispered, reaching toward him with trembling fingers that stopped just short of touching his face. David used to smile exactly like that when he was facing something that should have been impossible but that he was determined to endure anyway. The name meant nothing to Marcus's conscious mind, but something deeper responded to it with recognition that felt like coming home after a journey he couldn't remember taking. As Empress Lyraliai knelt before him in front of her entire court, tears streaming down her face while she whispered apologies for not recognizing him sooner, Marcus began to understand that his execution had been halted by something far more complex than mistaken identity or diplomatic intervention. Sometimes, it seemed, death was not the ending but merely an interruption in stories that transcended the boundaries of individual lifetimes. The private chambers where Empress Lyraliai brought Marcus after the chaos of the interrupted execution were as different from the formal throne room as starlight from candle flame. Here, crystal walls were softened by tapestries that depicted Sci-Fi history in flowing colors, while bioluminescent plants provided gentle illumination that seemed to respond to the emotional atmosphere of their occupants. Marcus sat in a chair that had been grown rather than built, its organic curves accommodating his human physiology while providing support that felt almost alive. His chains had been removed, though he understood that escape was neither possible nor necessary. Whatever had happened in the throne room had transformed him from condemned prisoner to something infinitely more complex. Empress Lyraliai paced before the curved windows that offered views of the Sci-Fi capital's crystal spires, her wings folded tightly against her back in the way that Marcus somehow knew indicated deep emotional distress. She had composed herself since her collapse in the throne room, but her control seemed fragile, maintained through sheer force of will rather than genuine calm. "Tell me about your dreams," she said without turning from the window, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone afraid that the wrong question might shatter possibilities too precious to risk. "I dream about flying," Marcus replied, surprised by how natural it felt to answer honestly rather than maintaining the cautious responses that had characterized his interrogations. "Through cities made of crystal and light, holding someone whose face I can never see clearly. Always the same promise, that I'll come back, that death won't be the end. Lyraliai's wings shivered with involuntary movement that suggested his words were striking deeper than casual conversation. What else? A scar, Marcus said, touching his left temple where a crescent-shaped mark had appeared during adolescence with no explanation for its origin. I've had this since I was 16, but I've never been injured there. And sometimes I wake up with the taste of Sci-Fi honey wine in my mouth, even though I've never consumed it. David had that exact scar, Lyraliai whispered, finally turning to face him with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated grief and impossible hope. From a training accident when we were learning to fly together. He said it was worth it because I kissed it better afterward. The memory hit Marcus with force that suggested personal experience rather than second-hand information. He could almost feel the sensation of wind through feathers he'd never possessed, the trust required to let someone teach him to navigate aerial currents that should have been utterly foreign to human physiology. Who was David? Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would challenge everything he thought he understood about identity and consciousness. Lyraliai moved to a crystalline cabinet and withdrew a holographic projector that created three-dimensional images in the air between them. The figure that materialized was unmistakably human, tall, dark-haired, with features that could have been Marcus's own reflection if not for subtle differences in expression and bearing. Captain David Reed, Lyraliai said, her voice carrying the reverence reserved for the beloved dead. Human diplomatic attaché during the first contact period 20 years ago. He was assigned to cultural exchange protocols and somehow became everything to me. The hologram shifted through various images, David in formal diplomatic attire, David laughing at something off-camera, David wearing modified Sci-Fi flight gear as he learned to navigate their aerial cities with artificial wings strapped to his human frame. Your species weren't supposed to be able to learn flight, Lyraliai continued, her eyes fixed on the images with the intensity of someone reviewing sacred texts. The neural pathways are completely different, the balance requirements incompatible with human physiology. But David was determined to understand my world from the inside, and somehow he managed to adapt. Marcus studied the holographic David, noting similarities that went beyond simple physical resemblance. The way he held his head when concentrating, his habit of touching his left temple when thinking through complex problems, the expression of gentle determination that seemed familiar from 1,000 mornings in the mirror. What happened to him? Marcus asked, though the question felt like learning details of his own death rather than discovering the fate of a stranger. The peace accords were fragile, Lyraliai said, her wings trembling with memory of old pain. There were factions on both sides who preferred conflict to cooperation. David was investigating intelligence leaks that suggested someone was trying to sabotage the negotiations when raiders attacked Research Station Harmony. The hologram shifted to show official records, damaged installations, casualty lists, and finally a memorial service where young Lyraliai stood beside an empty crystalline tomb while hundreds of beings from both species paid their respects to someone who had died trying to preserve their fragile peace. He could have evacuated with the other diplomatic staff, Lyraliai continued, her voice breaking slightly as she relived events that had shaped 20 years of her life. Instead, he stayed to help defend the research teams who couldn't abandon their work quickly enough. The last transmission we received was his voice saying that he loved me and that somehow, someday, he would find his way back to me. Marcus felt emotions that couldn't possibly be his own flooding through his consciousness, desperate love for someone with silver wings, determination to protect people who depended on his courage, the strange peace that came with knowing that death in service of others was a worthy ending to any life. I've been having those exact memories, Marcus said quietly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown space. Not as dreams, but as experiences. I remember promising to come back to you. Remember the way you cried when they told you I was staying behind. Lyraliai's composure finally shattered completely as she collapsed into the chair across from him, her face buried in her hands while 20 years of suppressed grief poured out in sobs that seemed to shake the crystal walls around them. I never believed the old stories about soul reincarnation, she said through her tears. Even among my people, most consider it mythology rather than documented phenomenon. But when you smiled at me in the throne room, I saw David so clearly that for a moment I forgot he was dead. Marcus found himself moving to comfort her without conscious decision, his hands settling on her shoulders with familiarity that suggested muscle memory rather than appropriate sympathy. The contact created a sensation like completing an electrical circuit, warmth and recognition that flooded through both of them with intensity that seemed to confirm connections beyond normal human understanding. "The evidence against me," Marcus said as understanding began crystallizing around the impossible implications of their conversation. Someone who knew David's tactical preferences, someone with access to identification codes and psychological profiles. Someone who wants to restart the war that David died to prevent, Lyralii finished, her mind following the same logical progression. Someone who discovered your resemblance to him and has been using it to frame you for crimes that would make peace impossible. The political implications were staggering. If Marcus truly was David's reincarnation, then his execution for war crimes would not only eliminate a symbol of human seraphy cooperation but would provide justification for military actions that could destroy everything the original David had sacrificed his life to protect. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, feeling the weight of circumstances that transcended personal survival and touched the future of interspecies relations. Lyralii looked up at him with eyes that held determination mixed with love that had survived 20 years of separation and apparent death. "Now we prove that some bonds are stronger than death, and we find whoever has been trying to destroy the peace that brought us together in the first place." As they sat together in the gentle light of her private chambers, Marcus began to understand that his interrupted execution had been more than a case of mistaken identity, it had been the first step in a journey to reclaim not just his innocence, but a love that had transcended the boundaries of individual lifetimes to find expression in new forms. The investigation that followed Lyralii's recognition of Marcus challenged both human science and Sci-Fi's spirituality in ways that forced uncomfortable questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of love itself. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived from the human embassy with medical equipment designed to resolve mysteries that conventional analysis had failed to explain, while healer Nixandra brought Sci-Fi techniques for examining spiritual resonance patterns that their species used to identify reincarnated souls. "The genetic analysis is definitive," Dr. Chen reported after 3 days of comprehensive testing, her expression combining scientific fascination with professional bewilderment. "Marcus Reed and David Reed share no biological relationship whatsoever. They're not even from the same continental gene pool. David's ancestry traces to European colonies while Marcus was born to families with East Asian heritage. Yet the neural patterns are identical," healer Nixandra added, her ethereal features reflecting the same confusion that marked Dr. Chen's analysis. "Brain wave configurations that control personality formation, memory storage, and emotional processing show congruence that should be impossible between unrelated individuals." Marcus submitted to the tests with patient cooperation, though the results were creating more questions than answers. Detailed brain scans revealed neural pathways that matched David's patterns with precision that defied statistical probability, while psychological evaluations uncovered personality traits and behavioral quirks that aligned perfectly with the dead diplomat's psychological profile. "The birth timing is the most disturbing factor," Dr. Chen continued, reviewing data that seemed to mock conventional understanding of biological processes. Marcus was born on Kepler Station at exactly 1427 Universal Standard Time on March 15, 2387. David Reed died at Research Station Harmony at 1427 UST on the same date. Simultaneous death and birth across impossible distances, Lyralii said softly, her wings trembling with recognition of patterns that Sci-Fi mythology had described for millennia. "Our legends speak of souls so determined to return that they immediately seek new forms when their current bodies fail." The medical evidence was compelling but incomplete, raising possibilities that neither species' understanding of consciousness could adequately explain. Marcus found himself caught between scientific skepticism and growing certainty that his memories of David's life were genuine experiences rather than elaborate psychological construction. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said hesitantly, apparently reluctant to share information that would further complicate their investigation. "The quantum resonance patterns in Marcus's neural tissue show entanglement signatures that match samples we collected from David's personal effects 20 years ago." Quantum entanglement in biological systems? Lyralii asked, her scientific training warring with her emotional investment in the results. Theoretical until now, Dr. Chen confirmed. But the data suggests that certain consciousness patterns can maintain coherence across what we assumed were insurmountable barriers. If David's neural configuration somehow impressed itself on quantum structures that existed independently of his biological form, then reincarnation might be explainable through advanced physics rather than spiritual faith, Marcus finished, understanding beginning to crystallize around evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about identity and continuity of consciousness. The investigation into his false charges proceeded alongside the exploration of his impossible connection to David, revealing a conspiracy that exploited both his resemblance to the dead diplomat and the political tensions that had simmered for 20 years since David's sacrifice. The identification codes used in the attacks were generated through a sophisticated hacking program that accessed archived diplomatic files, reported Commander Torres, the human security specialist who had joined their investigation. Someone with intimate knowledge of both human and Sci-Fi intelligence systems has been planning this for years. The biological evidence was planted using samples collected from David's personal effects in the embassy archives, added Captain Velnari, her Sci-Fi intelligence training allowing her to recognize patterns that crossed cultural boundaries. The perpetrator had access to materials that should have been impossible to obtain without authorization from the highest levels of both governments. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, a coordinated effort to frame Marcus for war crimes that would justify military actions and destroy the peace that David had died to preserve. The evidence trail led to someone with access to classified materials from both species, intimate knowledge of David's tactical preferences, and understanding of Marcus's existence and resemblance to the dead diplomat. Colonel Harrison Webb, Dr. Chen announced after completing analysis of recovered intelligence files. Human diplomatic security, assigned to embassy protection during the original peace negotiations. He had access to David's personal files, knowledge of the reincarnation research that we've been conducting, and most importantly, he was present when Marcus was born on Kepler Station. The revelation that Webb had been manipulating events for 2 decades, using Marcus as an unwitting pawn in a plan to restart interspecies warfare, explained both the overwhelming evidence against him and the precision with which the attacks had been carried out. He's been watching me my entire life, Marcus realized with growing horror at the scope of his manipulation. Creating opportunities for me to be in the right places at the right times, ensuring that evidence would point to me when he was ready to implement his plan. And he nearly succeeded, Lyralii said, her fury directed at someone who had almost destroyed the love that had transcended death itself. If you hadn't smiled in the throne room, if I hadn't recognized David in that expression, you would have died for his crimes and our peoples would be at war within months. The confrontation with Webb took place in the same throne room where Marcus's execution had been interrupted, though now the chamber hosted a very different kind of justice. The disgraced colonel faced charges that included treason, war crimes, and conspiracy to restart interstellar conflict, his decades of planning unraveled by the simple fact that love had proved stronger than death. You couldn't leave it alone, could you? Webb said with bitter satisfaction despite his certain fate. David Reed should have stayed dead instead of coming back to interfere with military necessity. Peace between species is a luxury that history will prove impossible to maintain. Perhaps, Lyralii replied with the composed authority that marked her rule, but history will also show that some bonds are strong enough to survive attempts at destruction, and that those who fight for love rather than power often find strength they never knew they possessed. Webb's capture and confession provided the evidence necessary to clear Marcus of all charges while exposing the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in destroying everything David had died to protect. But more importantly, it confirmed that Marcus's connection to David was genuine rather than elaborate deception. So what happens now? Marcus asked as they stood together in the crystalline gardens outside the palace, watching Sci-Fi younglings learn to fly under the guidance of their elders. Now, Lyralii said, her wings extending to catch the evening light as she smiled with joy that had been 20 years in the making, we discover what love looks like when it gets a second chance to build the future it was meant to create. As Marcus watched her prepare for flight, he felt artificial wings responding to neural commands he had never learned but somehow remembered, carrying him into skies that felt like coming home to places he had never been but had always known he would return to. 6 months after the revelation that transformed him from condemned war criminal to living proof that love could transcend death itself, Marcus stood on the observation platform of the celestial spire, watching the binary sunset paint the crystal city in colors that existed nowhere else in the known galaxy. The artificial wings that had replaced his executed identity as an ordinary human fit his shoulders as naturally as if he'd been born with them, their neural interfaces responding to thoughts he remembered learning from someone else's memories. The title he now carried, Special Ambassador for Interspecies Understanding, represented more than diplomatic recognition of his unique circumstances. Marcus had become a bridge between human and Sci-Fi cultures in ways that formal negotiations could never achieve, his dual nature as David's reincarnation and his own distinct individual allowing him to understand both species' perspectives with unprecedented clarity. The Council of Worlds has approved the expanded cultural exchange program, Lyralii reported as she joined him on the platform, her wings folding gracefully as she settled beside him with the comfortable intimacy that had grown from their renewed connection. 12 more systems want to establish diplomatic relations based on the cooperation models we've developed. David would be proud, Marcus said, though the statement carried complexity that still surprised him. His memories of David's life remained distinct from his own experiences, like having access to a beloved friend's diary rather than recalling personal history. Yet the emotional connections felt authentic, love for Lyralii that transcended individual identity, commitment to peace that justified any personal sacrifice, hope for cooperation that could transform how different species approached each other. You would be proud, Lyralii corrected gently, her silver eyes reflecting understanding of the delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the present. David's love for peace lives in you, but the specific achievements are yours. The person who convinced the Rigel Confederation to join the cultural exchange program was Marcus Reed, not a memory of someone who died 20 years ago. Their relationship had evolved into something unprecedented, love that honored the connection that had brought them together while building new dimensions that belonged to who they were becoming rather than who they had been. Marcus remained distinctly himself, with interests and perspectives that differed from David's, but their bond felt like a continuation of something that death had interrupted rather than ended. The reincarnation research has attracted attention from xenobiologists throughout human space, Marcus mentioned, thinking about the communications they'd been receiving from scientists who wanted to study the quantum consciousness phenomena that had made his existence possible. Dr. Chen thinks we might be looking at evidence for universal continuity of identity that transcends biological death. And the Sci-Fi archives are documenting similar cases throughout our history, Lyralii added with satisfaction. Stories we had dismissed as mythology are being re-evaluated as potential evidence for consciousness transfer that occurs more frequently than either species realized. Their work together had become the foundation for new approaches to interspecies cooperation that emphasized emotional connection and mutual understanding rather than purely political or economic arrangements. The success of their partnership had inspired similar bonds between individuals from different species, creating a network of relationships that were transforming diplomatic culture throughout known space. Colonel Webb's trial concluded today, Lyralii mentioned, her tone carrying the satisfaction of justice served while remaining free of vindictive pleasure. Life imprisonment for treason and war crimes, with his confession providing evidence that prevented several other conspiracies from reaching implementation. Marcus nodded, feeling closure for events that had nearly cost him his life while threatening everything David had died to protect. Webb's capture had exposed a broader network of military officers and political extremists who preferred conflict to cooperation, their arrest preventing wars that could have consumed entire star systems. Any regrets? Marcus asked, using a question that had become ritual between them as they navigated the complexities of love renewed and peace preserved. Only one, Lyralii replied with the smile that indicated her answer would blend humor with genuine feeling. What's that? I regret that it took your near execution for me to find you again, Lyralii said, her wings spreading to catch the evening breeze as they prepared for their nightly flight through the Crystal City. Though I suppose the universe has its own sense of timing about when souls are ready to be reunited. Marcus laughed, extending his own artificial wings as neural pathways that felt like recovered memories prepared him for flight that combined David's learned skills with his own developing expertise. Perfect timing, he assured her. Any sooner, and we wouldn't have been ready for what we've built together. As they launched themselves into the crystalline air above the Sci-Fi capital, Marcus reflected on the journey from condemned criminal to cultural ambassador that had taught him the most important lesson about identity and continuity. Love doesn't just survive death, it transforms and adapts, finding new expressions that honor the past while embracing possibilities that neither life alone could have achieved. Same time tomorrow? Marcus asked as they soared between spires that caught starlight and transformed it into music that both species could appreciate. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, Lyraeli replied, her words carrying the weight of promises that had survived execution, death, and 20 years of separation. Though I suspect our conversations will be less about finding each other and more about helping others discover that the strongest bonds can survive anything the universe chooses to put between them. Below them, the lights of the crystal city sparkled like captured stars, while above them, the actual stars wheeled in patterns that suggested infinite possibilities for beings brave enough to love across the boundaries of species, time, and the fundamental nature of identity itself. Sometimes, Marcus had learned, the most important executions are the ones that are interrupted by smiles that carry memories of love too strong to be contained by death, and sometimes the most powerful queens are the ones who fall to their knees when they recognize that some connections transcend every law except the universal imperative to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and the future over the past that tried to destroy it. In the distance, other couples from various species flew together through skies that had become symbols of cooperation and understanding, their partnerships inspired by the proof that Marcus and Lyraeli provided. That love authentic enough can bridge any gap, survive any separation, and find expression in forms that honor both who they were and who they're becoming together.